place, and I'll never forget the moment when the BBC producer in Gaza came through to me and he said, "Martin, Israeli soldiers have been kidnapped in Lebanon." And, a few hours later, that triggered the war between Lebanon and Israel. And 48 hours, I found myself in Beirut. So he went from Gaza to Jerusalem to Jordan. He drove through Syria, and we wound up in Beirut, 48 hours, covering a conflict there. And so I was 26, and I'll be honest with you, it was incredibly exhilarating. I think as you get older, you understand the terrible consequences. But I think when you're young...
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you?
Hello, Ray. I'm great. How are you today?
Outstanding. Today we have a special guest who is a foreign correspondent for BBC in Jerusalem, Kabul, Beijing, Lagos, and Beirut, just to name a few, and he's reported on many, many foreign conflicts. Please welcome Martin Patience to the show. Welcome, Martin.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Martin, you have a new book coming out, The Darker the Night, When Truth is a Lie. I love the title. And we're going to talk about that later. And I'm sure you're going to summarize some of the things in the book in our conversation tonight. So we'll definitely get into that, how people can order it, what all that stuff. So we usually like to start out, and Ray can pick it up here too, but we like to know people's roots. We call it kind of the Cold Red Wayback Machine. We didn't really invent that term, but this is kind of fun because we have younger people, we have middle-aged people. How did you wind up where you are now as a young journalist? How did it all begin?
Well, I don't feel young now. It all began about 20 years ago. As you can probably tell, I'm not from America. I'm from Glasgow, Scotland. So I grew up in a village just outside of Scotland's largest city. And I used to love reading the newspapers, particularly the back pages of the newspapers. Now, I think in America, that's probably the sports pages. In Scotland and Britain, it often was the sports pages. But in this broadsheet, it was actually the foreign pages. So I would see the news from around the world. And before I could even read that well, I saw that there was somebody called Reuters. So I thought they were called Reuters. And Reuters was somebody who went everywhere. It was, of course, the news agency, but they were in the Middle East, they were in Asia, they were in Africa. So I think I got a real appetite for the world. So we traveled as a family, but only within Europe. And I always had that kind of adventure gene within me. And I think the best way to do that was to become a foreign correspondent. I didn't know how to do it. So I did what is natural. I decided to go to the Middle East and learn Arabic. I'd been to the Middle East when I was 18. I remember as a young boy watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I saw Petra. I must have been about 7 or 8. It was the Sean Connery film. And I saw Petra and I was like, wow, where's that? So when I was 18, I wound up in the Middle East. I went to Jerusalem. I was close to Gaza. Subsequently, I decided to learn Arabic because I thought it would be the best way to become a foreign correspondent. And that's what I did. I ended up in Syria, where I spent a year, where I met my wife. She happens to be American, but that was 20 years ago. So that's where the story started.
Of course, Sean Connery was a Scotsman, so that kicked in with you right away.
Of course. Actually, I studied in the US, and Sean Connery actually had a scholarship program for Scottish students. Actually, I was a recipient of that. And so he gave me some money to study in New York. So I'll always be a big Sean Connery fan because in many ways he truly did change, the course of my life. He genuinely did. Although I never met him. Never met.
Interesting.
Not yet, anyways. Not yet.
Well, he's passed. He's passed.
I don't think it's going to happen now.
I said not yet. I didn't say. I didn't say
unless,
Mark, you know what I mean?
Unless Ray may know something we don't, as he tends to pretend he does on many occasions.
Are you going to connect me with dead people? Is there something I don't know about this podcast?
We have all kinds. We have all kinds of things in our toolbox, Martin. Just so you know.
That's our spin-off podcast called Colder Red. but that's coming to a podcast near you. Anyway, Ray, you were about to ask a question.
I if just for our audience's knowledge, when you say 20 years ago, are we talking like around 2000, 2001?
Yeah,
when you went over there?
Well, I studied Arabic in both Egypt and Syria, and I flew to Egypt on September the 11th, 2002. And one of the reasons I picked that day, believe it or not, was because the flights were cheap, because it was obviously the 1 year anniversary of 9/11. So I was, 9/11 obviously made it a huge news story. I think as a journalist, you have to look at two things. One, where the news is, and second of all, how you would cover it, what are the skills you need. So I certainly knew that the Middle East, I'd been in the Middle East before, but I certainly knew the Middle East was going to be incredibly newsy in the years ahead.
Yeah, how were tensions when you were over there? You were young. Tensions were pretty high in a lot of the parts. You talk Syria, tensions were high there. You talk Egypt, tensions were high there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in Syria, there was a lot of Iraqi refugees, so they come because the war in Iraq started in 2003. I was in Syria from 2004 to 2005. So you saw an influx of Iraqis into Syria. And I remember speaking to a young Iraqi. It was outside the Umayyad Mosque, which is a beautiful mosque in Damascus. And, she came up to us and said, "Are you American?" I said, actually, no, I'm not, but my friend was American. She was very nice. She was incredibly, was a lovely woman, but clearly tensions then, even till this day, remain incredibly high because some people associate citizens with the government or the policies of the government.
Yeah.
You always need to be aware of that.
Yeah. Did anything occur or anything happen to you? Because when I look at you, and I look at Scotsman, Irishman, and a lot of European, you look American, and people just kind of get ready.
Better or worse, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, this may sound flip, but I think there is a lot of truth in this, in the sense that being Scottish 20 years ago in the Middle East was a few years after a film came out called Braveheart. In Arabic, it's Khal the Shujaa. And so when people heard that I was Scottish, you would often hear Melchitstan. So there was this feeling that Scottish people were on the side of freedom and fighting their oppressors. So ironically, I think in some ways, I remember one time, for example, I was in Egypt. It was during a Danish newspaper had published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. So it was another moment of high tension in the region. That was around 2006. And I was actually out reporting my own, and I was surrounded by about 40 guys. And they just asked me, "Are you Danish?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm Scottish." And as soon as one of them heard that, they said, "Braveheart," and it completely diffused the situation. So I think these small cultural touchstones can actually get you out a lot of problems at times.
Well, Martin, a big cultural touchstone happened in January of 2002, just as you were assuming your journalism career from what you've told us, and that was the murder of Daniel Pearl, a Wall Street Journal reporter in Pakistan. And I worked that case. Ray, I'm not sure if you cover any leads on that. I think it was out of our Newark division of the FBI. And we're going to talk about some kidnappings coming up of a journalist and a soldier, but he didn't make it. And there was some ransom demand made. So here you are at the genesis, at the vanguard of your career. And I'm sure you read that article, and there may be loved ones, parents. I'm not sure you knew your wife yet, but you sure you want to do this, Martin?
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned my parents. I was a freelancer from sort of 2004 to 2005, and I spent a lot of time in Gaza. And I used to take the public transport in Gaza. I'd take the bus down from Gaza City to Khan Yunis to Rafah, all these towns and cities that are in the news right now. And I'll never forget, I used to work with a local fixer down there, a great guy, and he used to say to me, Martin, your skin is like shining gold, because there was a lot of kidnaps going on at that time. I knew that was a risk. I think it's always tougher on parents and families. I think what I always did was I was always very safe. I would always check in with people. I wouldn't spend too long in locations. And the people that I stayed with and I met with, I trusted. Other people that I trusted them. So that's really important that you know who you're going to see and know what you're potentially getting into. You can't, of course, look, you can't get rid of the whole risk, but you can try and minimize it the best you can. And that's something I always did. And I think when I joined the DVC, certainly my mother relaxed a lot because it meant I wasn't out on my own. It meant I had a big organization behind me. Guys like you, if God forbid anything went wrong, there would be kind of the action plan would swing into place.
Are you still, do you still consider yourself fluent in Arabic? Not an easy language to learn from a native English speaker.
I would no. I certainly would never have considered myself fluent. I did it about a year and a half. It's like learning Italian, Spanish, French, with a different script all in one. So, I can understand a lot. I can ask the right questions, but fluency, fluency. I was away from the region for a long time, so I would have loved to stay with it. I would have loved to potentially become fluent, but no, it's a difficult language, but it's also a beautiful language.
And what people don't realize, there's formal Arabic, which you may learn in the classroom. No one speaks it.
Exactly.
They may write it in business letters, perhaps, but no one speaks formal Arabic. And what you learn in the classroom, I'm told, is very different than what you would communicate,
No,
personally.
it's like learning Shakespeare and then going to Starbucks and trying to order a cafe latte and a donut with Shakespearean language. Nobody's going to understand what's going on. So it's a lifetime's work. I'm not saying French or Spanish are easy, but I think if you do 6 months to a year or even a couple of years you live in those countries and you're a reasonable linguist, then I think you'll get pretty good. Arabic, it just takes a lot longer.
Not to mention writing right side to left side.
Exactly. Well, actually, you know what? That's like driving. You just get used to it.
Well, maybe less dangerous, but depending who's reading what you're writing, I don't know, in some of those parts of the world. So did you get a degree in journalism? You mentioned the scholarship thanks to Sean Connery. Did you have a degree in journalism? From what school?
So what's interesting, I did. I had an interest in that. I left school when I was 17. I went to acting school. I was terrible at that. I was the back end of the course. So I decided to give that up. Then I ended up with a history degree, which I thought was fantastic because it's all about, to understand the present, you have to understand, the past, facts, marshalling arguments. And then I did end up in New York, at Columbia. I'll be honest with you, I hadn't heard of Columbia. I asked my professor, what are the best journalism schools in America? And he said Columbia, he said Missouri, and he said Berkeley. And I said, well, Columbia is a 1-year scholarship, so 1 year. So I went there. And then off the back of that, I was very lucky to get a scholarship to study more Arabic. American is very good to me in that sense, and it's really good.
Glad to hear that.
That's good. If I were to say to you, hey, Martin, I have this penchant to want to become a journalist and cover a lot of the things that are happening overseas, what kind of advice would you give me to do that?
Today, right?
Today. It's really tough today because journalism's in such a kind of tough place. There's not a lot of money in the profession, so a lot of young kids are going out on their own and they're really exposed. I think languages are key. If you're going to understand a culture, you've got to be able to speak to the people, and that often involves speaking their language. you got to be tough as well. You got to be prepared to stick it out. I mean, just to give you an example, in Jerusalem, for example, I lived in somebody's couch for 8 months. I was living off $300-400, a month. It was tough. I couldn't afford to go home. But I think if you've got a dream, you have to kind of really sort of tough it out. And then, do you know what? You just keep going. Because if you want something bad enough, you just keep going until you get it. You just don't take no for an answer. You have to be resilient, you have to be resourceful, and you have to just keep on going.
Well, how did you get started? How did you get started with this?
So how did I get started? So I started as a newspaper boy, and then I did work experience when I was a placement when I was 15 at a local newspaper. I then worked at the student newspaper when I was packing newspapers overnight at a factory on Saturday nights. I then won an award, actually. I was the Student Journalist of the Year. That then got me onto the national newspapers in Scotland when I was sort of 2021. So I was working on those newspapers. And then, so that combination of experience plus Arabic, that opened up doors with a couple of job offers, one with AP to be their Iraq in-bed correspondent in 2005. So that'd be going out endlessly with the US military at the height of the war there. I said no. I felt it was too dangerous. And then I got the opportunity with the BBC as well. And then when I was in the BBC, as long as you work hard, you're resourceful, you do a good job, the doors open up to other opportunities. So I get the right skills. I was in the right place. I do think you make your own luck, but you also need to be lucky. So I had that combination.
Can you remember your very first story that actually made it to AP or Reuters? And I mean, looking back, would you have done that differently today? Just curious how that worked. I can remember my first arrest. I know Ray can in our business. You must have that first article that got.
I've got first. It's the Glasgow Evening Times. It's the evening newspaper, and it was about a steam train that was travelling from Scotland to England. And I remember I said, I'll never forget the editor changed the intro. I said to the editor, I said, the steam train rattled from Glasgow to some English city. And he's like, Martin, it's a steam train. It's huffed. A steam train. So, I think, so what was that? That was almost 30 years ago. I know that newspaper article is sitting somewhere in a box in my parents' house to this day, and I will fish it out. But yeah, of course, everybody remembers it. It's just a wonderful, I feel for journalists now, because there's something really beautiful about writing a story and then seeing it in print, seeing it in the newspaper. It's like seeing a picture that you took up on the wall. I think it's different when it's digital. I think when you actually see in front of, there's something rather magical about
it.
That's very cool. I like that story.
Yeah.
So you're back, you somehow wind up is Jerusalem kind of your first port of call when you went to the Middle East?
Yeah, so Jerusalem, when I was in Jerusalem, 2005 to 2008, so I spent 3 years there. The big stories were the Jewish settlements in Gaza were withdrawn during the time I was there. I covered that for USA Today from the Palestinian side. So that was a kind of remarkable story. I'll never forget that when the Palestinians actually went into those Jewish settlements, which Israel had evacuated, they all came up to me to ask for directions. And I was like, why are they asking me? And then the penny dropped. I'd been in the settlements and they never had. So that was, I'll never forget the quote of one Palestinian man. He said to me, it's like taking a drive in the countryside, because Gaza, of course, it's about 4 or 5 times the size of Manhattan. And it's incredibly densely populated. So when those settlements in which Israelis lived were evacuated or moved out the Gaza Strip, it freed up all this land which the Palestinians then piled into. So that was one big story. second big story, I think, was when Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, he was kidnapped in 2006. I was in Gaza when the Israeli assault for that took place, and I'll never forget the moment when the BBC producer in Gaza came through to me and he said, "Martin, Israeli soldiers have been kidnapped in Lebanon." And, a few hours later, that triggered the war between Lebanon and Israel. And 48 hours ago, I found myself in Beirut. So he went from Gaza to Jerusalem to Jordan. He drove through Syria, and we wound up in Beirut 48 hours, covering a conflict there. And so I was 26, and I'll be honest with you, it was incredibly exhilarating. I think as you get older, you understand the terrible consequences. But I think when you're young, it's the dirty secret. It can be exhilarating. It can be very exciting. I mean, I'll never forget driving. The Israelis bombed Beirut airport, and I remember driving to the airport, and there was through one of the tunnels, and there was just a shaft of light, like a rocket, had come through the tunnel and opened it all up. And I think one of the most terrifying moments in my life was when I was in the southern suburbs, the Dahi, which was the Hezbollah stronghold, and the war was being fought between Israel and Hezbollah, and the bombing started. The Israelis started bombing, and I happened to be there on my own, and a guy just turned up on a scooter, and I jumped in the back of her. And I remember no helmet on this back of the scooter, bombs not too close, but probably a kilometre away, but it certainly felt closer. And I remember just, every time a bomb would go off, I would jump, and I felt I was going to fall off the scooter. And there was another point at the airport, you just realise how jumpy people are. I did that classic thing of, I took a photograph of what I thought was an empty road, and it wasn't an empty road. There was actually a military checkpoint there. And suddenly guys all appeared with their guns, and it was a kind of classic hands up in the air. And we managed to talk them down. So that was, Gaza, and then 2006 was the first kind of real taste of it. And what was very interesting from my point of view was that I then covered it from the Israeli side as well. So I think that's really unusual when you get to see things from every side. I think that's what's quite remarkable about being a journalist. I don't necessarily even think diplomats get that. But you speak to all the players. For example, when I was in Gaza, you would meet the Hamas leaders. When you're in Jerusalem, I remember the doors opened up one day in the building. Who was standing there? Benjamin Netanyahu. I found moving between all these worlds quite extraordinary, actually, because you were speaking to people that wanted to kill other people. But that is the joy of being a journalist, is going into difficult and dangerous places, speaking to people, and putting questions to them, but also trying to understand them, their point of view. That's not to say you have to agree with them, of course not, but to understand where they're coming from, and hopefully share some of that with the audience, because ultimately that's what drives conflict. It's often, two peoples or two countries looking at one thing from very different points of view.
Amazing stories. Go ahead.
It is amazing. I want to take a step back to the Israeli soldier that you talked about, Gilad Shalit. He was kidnapped. What were if you know, and I'm sure you do, the circumstances around that? Was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? How did this happen? That he was able to get caught?
I think what happened with that, I'll be honest with you, my memory, I think they dug a tunnel, and then they popped up out the tunnel, so a tunnel from Gaza into Israel, and I think it was a military post. So it was similar to what we saw last year, but on a far smaller scale. So it was kind of one-off, and I think they took this tunnel, they managed to overwhelm the post. I think several Israeli soldiers were killed, but they managed to grab Gilad Shalit and take him into the tunnel. where he was held captive in Gaza for several years. Yeah. It was interesting, I used to speak with his father, and occasionally speak with his father. So it was an incredibly painful time, obviously, for his family. He did get out, though. He did eventually get out.
Yeah, it looks like October of 2011, he was released in a prisoner exchange. And I'm not sure the exact numbers. Usually it's several dozen to 100 or more of Palestinian prisoners that are released, usually for one or two Israelis. So I'm sure it was something like that. And
it was hundreds.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think including the current Hamas leader was one of those released.
And that's why they know it's such a valuable part of their, strategies, their military strategies to kidnap people, which of course there's still 100 more or so people kidnapped after October 7th, including Americans. I'm not sure there's any Scottish involved. I think
there's no Scottish.
Some UK people, I think, perhaps being held.
I don't think there's certainly British Israelis, several British Israelis.
We don't hear a whole lot about that. I hope they're not being forgotten, and we can maybe broach that a little bit later. Yeah, but I can't. Did you ever have a chance? You interviewed his father. Did you ever get a chance to sit down with Khalid Shalit after he was released?
No, I didn't. I'd actually left the region, so I didn't. But I know, for example, I had a colleague who was kidnapped in Gaza in 2007.
Alan Johnston, correct?
Alan Johnston. So he was kidnapped for about 4 months. It wasn't by Hamas. And the irony in his situation was, believe it or not, was Hamas that actually bought him out. He was kidnapped by a kind of splinter, kind of extremist Sunni organization who I think wanted to make a name for themselves. So that's why they went for the BBC correspondent. He was held for 4 months, and that was, I'll say, incredibly difficult for him, incredibly difficult on his family. I remember one situation, I'd actually gone on leave, and I've been in the Himalayas trekking, because that's how I'd get away from everything. And I phoned my father. I think I've been out of contact for 4 or 5 days, and I phoned my father and I said, "Is there any news on Alan?" And he said, "Sorry, son, it's bad." I said, "What's happened?" He said, he's been executed. So what had happened was the group that had taken him had said that he'd been executed in order to ramp up the pressure on the BBC and the authorities to make some kind of deal. Fortunately, it wasn't true. Alan was subsequently released, and I saw him a couple of years ago. We had lunch in Glasgow. He's Scottish as well, so it was great to catch up with him. But it's a dangerous organisation, and Alan was incredibly cautious. He was an incredibly cautious, safe journalist, and it just shows you that a lot of this is about luck and timing.
Or bad luck and bad timing.
Yeah, exactly. Although I like to emphasize the luck and good time.
Well, we've said it before on Cold Red. I believe luck is a combination of opportunity and preparation. Right. And it sounds like you certainly had that as part of your background, and hopefully Alan Johnston did too. And he didn't piss off too many people, I guess, when they were kept him in custody. And I hope he wasn't tortured or anything like that. And I'm not sure if money was paid or some other prisoners were released for him to get it. But you said Hamas actually negotiated his way out.
Well, I tell you what happened was Hamas, the family that took him, Hamas started kidnapping members of that family. And then a man was brought in and it was agreed that kidnapping was un-Islamic, and both sides agreed to release their captives. So that's how that one went.
I guess they've changed their tune starting back on October 7th, but in terms of what's kidnapping, how it falls under their religious belief system. But again, we can come back to that.
Martin, I know that if someone I knew, like you knew Alan Johnson, was kidnapped and was held captive for approximately 4 months before he was released, I had a chance to sit down and talk to him. one of the first questions I'm going to ask, and I don't know if this is appropriate, but what was it like? How were you treated? What happened? What did they do to you? All those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he was, he wasn't tortured. But they didn't make him wear a suicide belt in a video. I think it's desperate because you've just no idea how long it's going to happen, how long it's going to go on for. But also, I think there's a lot of guilt. That you've put yourself in that situation, and it's not just you paying the price, but it's your family and those that love you. And I think all journalists, anybody who works in an dangerous environment, including you gentlemen, we do it because we love it, but it can be selfish at times. And I think when things really go wrong, you realise that it can be terrible for your family. It really can be. And, that's part of the reason that's why, I left the Middle East and came to America. You realise that the more you do it, the more likely it is that something will go wrong. Just to give you an example, I remember the first time a mortar went over my head. It's actually going into Gaza, and we had to take cover that were being fired by Palestinian militants. I think about 15 years later, I was covering the Turkish had invaded northern Syria. So the war was taking place between the Turks and the Kurds were firing back into Turkey, and I was standing doing a live, for, as we call it, for the TV, and a mortar went over my head and landed maybe about 100 meters away. And in that moment, I just had the realization that, this is how it can end. You're just standing there, and then a mortar lands nearby, and that's it. It's over. So I think that was one of the moments where I realized, you know what? I've done my time. It's time for me to move on.
Real quick, were you strictly a print journalist, or did you do any on-air radio or TV?
I was always BBC. I started off as online correspondent, and then when I was in Afghanistan for 2 years, China for 5 years, Nigeria for 2 years, a subsequent 4 years in the Middle East in Beirut. I was all radio and TV.
Oh, okay.
All radio and TV.
And that was my next question. And you're in the middle of some of these literally war zones, mortars going over your head. How would you file your reports? Your early days of cell phones, but I'm not sure. Did you go into some office with the teletype, or obviously a computer of some sort? How did you do that logistically to get it to the BBC, we'll say?
Well, if you go back to Afghanistan, so obviously, as you were out in the military embedded, the military embedded, but we specialized technology. It was called sort of EGANs, basically detected to satellites. So you could send over radio and TV that way. Often in the Middle East, the infrastructure is pretty good in the Middle East. You can always get out to, if you're covering Israel and the Palestinian territories, you'll have an office in Gaza, the BBC, of course, in Jerusalem, Beirut with an office. So you'd often go out, gather, and then come back to the office and file it. The issue is, for in places like Nigeria, if you're up in the northeast covering Boko Haram, you have technical issues with internet, so on and so forth. But you do have these beacons, so you can connect to the satellite, and that'll send over your reports. But it's often, you have to think a lot about, how am I actually going to send this report? How am I actually going to broadcast it to the world? That's why that's why I'm often jealous of the print guys. Push comes to shove, they can pick up a phone and say, I've got this story, and I'm just going to read it to you over the phone. Whereas with TV and radio, you can't really do that.
I have a question, and Jim is familiar with this as well. We had one of our own that was taken captive as well. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, Robert Levinson.
Yes.
Did you have anything to do or any involvement in covering that story?
I didn't. I actually, I went to Iran. I went in 2019 when tensions were incredibly high between America and Iran. And it looked like there might be a war. And I went that summer for 10 days to get the temperature, see what people were saying on the ground.
I want to stop you right here. Everyone listening. He hears there's a war. He wants to check out the temperature, U.S., Iran. So you go to the war zone. But that's what foreign correspondents do.
That's what we do, but it was the first time I ever said to my wife, I said, look, there's a small chance that something might happen. I was a bit concerned that I might be detained. And my gut was right, actually. A journalist was detained when I was there, a British journalist from The Economist. And he was held for a couple of months. It wasn't there wasn't a lot of publicity. But yeah, look, it's a remarkable country. I mean, it's remarkable. And it's a very polarized, divided country between, the conservative elements and the liberal elements. I mean, it's split down the middle. When we went to the holy city of Qom, which is the kind of conservative heartland, the first thing an Iranian official said when I arrived is he said to me, I hate the religious people of my country. And I was like, I thought maybe it was a kind of trap, so I could maybe say, so obviously you always have to be aware of that. You always have to remain diplomatic. But this guy really did not and he didn't know, and this was the government mind that. So it was a real illustration that this country was not on the same page. But yeah.
Well, interesting too, Iran is Persian, it's not Arabic. And they speak Farsi, not the Arabic language. I don't know if you spoke Farsi then or had a translator with you.
We had a translator, and that's always part of the compromise, because the translator he worked for a government-approved media house. So obviously the Iranian authorities knew exactly where we were going. In fact, we had to get some permission to go to certain places. So they knew where we were going, who we were speaking to. And I think from their point of view, they probably wanted to use it to get their side of the story out, their perspective, and that is always, part of journalism. I'll never forget, we did go to one of the big mosques in Tehran where they famously shout death to Israel, death to America. I didn't realize you also chant death to England. I didn't realize that. But one of the guys in the mosque came up to me, I'll never forget this, and he said to me, we used to chant death to Russia as well. Just remember, things can change. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Nothing stays the same. Things do change. Wars can happen, but peace can also happen as well. And I think we should always remember that the world is a very fragile place. Remarkable, terrible, but also remarkable things can happen as well.
You mentioned Nigeria kind of in passing, and many of us remember the Boko Haram situation where they kidnapped, was it several hundred young women?
Yeah.
Girls and women, and you were part of covering that, right?
Yeah, I wasn't there when they were actually kidnapped, but I did persuade the Nigerian military, I think it was on the second anniversary, to actually take me to that school where all the girls were kidnapped. That involved a huge amount of negotiation. I mean, in some ways, it's one of my greatest achievements. We flew up to the north. We spent 4 or 5 days waiting for the Nigerian military to take us. We weren't in a convoy. It was a 12-hour drive that day. And it was through Boko Haram territory. We went through Burntwood village after Burntwood village. There was sporadic Boko Haram attacks, not thankfully in our convoy, but then subsequently had friends who were UN convoys. And what happened on the exact same roads that I've been on would be the insurgents put a log across the road. and that obviously stopped the traffic. And because it was a long convoy, everybody was backed up, and then they would just fill the convoy full of bullets. It was, it was incredibly dangerous. It was remarkable to get to the school. The military were incredibly jumpy. They only gave us 20 minutes on the ground there. So we had to operate incredibly quickly, getting enough of the TV packing, doing stand-ups, getting shots, and then we moved on. But Nigeria was, I think the big challenge with Nigeria was, even compared to the Middle East or even China, is that the problem was in Nigeria, if something went wrong, you were in big trouble. You go out and in bed with the American military in Afghanistan, something goes wrong, support will arrive within 20 minutes. If you're badly injured, you will be medevac out of there. In Nigeria, that's not happening. That's not happening. And that's what makes Nigeria and other African countries, I think, difficult and dangerous at times to cover, just because when something goes wrong, often there's no backup.
And aren't some of these militants or the militias on the other side, aren't a lot of them in Nigeria children?
Yeah.
I mean, 12 years old with fully automatic, machine guns, and in their brains, they're developed differently than 12-year-olds in the U.S. or the U.K., but they're still not fully developed. And trigger finger with one of them could be instant death for a journalist such as yourself.
What was happening in Boko Haram was they just sweep into these villages, and as you say, if they don't kill or rape the women, they would pick up the young boys and they would train them to be militants, and that was the model. They would move from village to village. It's funny you talk about being brainwashed. One of the most shocking things I ever experienced, and I often think about it, was when I was in Afghanistan. We had a contact within the Afghan intelligence agency, and he said, "You want to come and meet a young suicide bomber, a failed suicide bomber? You can meet him, you can speak to him. You can't broadcast the interview, but you can have a chat with him, get some ideas." So it turned out at his office, and his young son was there, 11, 12-year-old boy. And I remember saying to the guy, I said, where's the young suicide bomber? And the boy who I thought was his son was his suicide.
No boy.
He was 12 years old, very slight, underfed, a lovely boy. And he'd been in a madrasa in Pakistan, which was supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And what he told me, I'll never forget, he told me that a mullah turns up and he said they wanted volunteers for a heroic mission, the whole heroic mission being a suicide mission, and obviously if they carried it out, they would go straight to heaven. And, you're 11, 12 years old, this is the whole world, the only world you've ever known. And of course you want to, be rewarded by God. So, this young boy volunteered along with all the other young boys in the madrasa. And the reason they often use kids is exactly for that reason. They're kids, and people respect kids less than they would, say, a young man approaching a checkpoint. So, that's the sadness. You see these kids, these young kids who never had a chance in life, and I think in quieter moments, I remember there was a young girl in Gaza wrapped in a shroud that had been killed. I remember in Indonesia, there was a young girl, she was Rohingya. Her mother had brought her over, and they were trying to get from Myanmar to Malaysia in boats. The girl fallen ill in the boat, and I remember we saw her in hospital. She was getting treatment, and I went in the next day and the bed was empty. I said, "Where's the young girl?" And she died. And then I remember in Nigeria, there was a lot of starvation and famine. There was a young boy called Muhammad, and they were trying to get we were trying to get meds into him. But he was so dehydrated that they couldn't get a needle into him. I remember the doctor just saying, "I don't think he's going to make it." So, you carry these memories with you, but you also see remarkable things. I mean, I'll never forget, for example, an Israeli man whose son had been kidnapped and killed, and yet he was wandering around, the Palestinian West Bank because he believed that the only way to resolve this conflict was by reaching out to Palestinians. So you have people that have suffered enormously, and yet they put their losses to try and make things better for all of us. You really do see the best and worst of humanity, and it's remarkable.
I know Ray has a question. Just let me finish up. Whatever happened to the Boko Haram? Some girls, I think, were rescued, but I think there's some, and this was 10 years ago or so, 12 years ago?
Yeah, some were rescued. I think there was a deal to free a lot of them. I think dozens. The problem was they were, raped or forced into forced marriages, and then they had kids with some of the fighters. But then it becomes more complicated. Are they allowed to leave? Are they allowed to take children with them? And then I think probably quite a few of them probably died as well. Just mountain military operations like that's just from starvation and disease from being out in the bush. Yeah.
Sad.
Martin, what you've seen in your career is nothing. Sometimes I don't know how you deal with it, but when I look a question to you from me and for our audience is you dealt with insurgents in Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and the Taliban. You dealt with all those different factions, and then you dealt with the militants, the militia in the Boko Haram. And what did you see, if any, the biggest difference between both factions?
Or the biggest common denominator?
Or biggest common denominator? Sure.
Lack of opportunities. If young men don't have jobs and prospects, then they're going to turn to extremists. It doesn't matter what country you're in, if people don't have opportunities, things are going to go wrong. And this isn't it's not a religious thing. We saw it in Europe, for example, 100 years ago in the run-up to the Second World War, extremism. Yeah, if people don't have opportunities, they're going to do that stuff. And it's the economy. And, without being flippant, I really do think it's the economy. If you can sort out the economy, give people jobs and a good living, then make it something to live for. If not, they're easy prey for the militants.
Wow. You had a colleague in Afghanistan that was killed. And I'm sorry that happened. But what were the circumstances around that?
So he was our fixer in the south of the country. Southern Afghanistan was where the British military was operating at that time, and he was in Helmand province. He was kidnapped. A couple of days later, the body was found. We don't think he was killed by the Taliban. We don't know what happened there. If it was a family dispute, if it was militants, if it was criminality. The truth is, in a lot of these countries, is that when something goes wrong and somebody dies, you often don't get to the bottom of it because it's just too dangerous or people are too scared. But he was, in all these places I've been, often it's the kind of foreign correspondents. We're the ones that are, held up in the limelight, all that kind of stuff. But it's the local journalists. They're the ones that take the biggest risk. They're the ones that get families living in these countries. As I always say to people, what's the worst that can ever happen to me? They kicked me out of the country. So whereas often in other countries, even in China, for example, I was there for 5 years, pressure. We could pressure the local journalists. In terms of Afghanistan, local journalists took huge risks to serve Western audiences, and many of them paid the ultimate price.
Wow.
Do you want to tell us about, you were at the BBC about 15 years and
Yes.
you sort of moved on and you kept busy, but you've written a book in the last year or more.
Well, we're written a book, one of the things about, the good thing about journalism is you're constrained by the facts. We're good journalists. The bad thing about journalism is you're constrained by the facts. So when I was in Beirut, I just wanted a kind of project almost to keep me sane. So I wrote this novel. I used to write in a coffee shop every morning. I try and write for an hour. So it was published last year. It is a thriller. It's set in Scotland. It's about a journalist, but also a police officer. My sister's a police officer. It's a political thriller. And believe it or not, it's actually based on a true story. It's about an election that takes place in Scotland. And days before that election, or the referendum on Scottish independence takes place, a top civil servant ends up dead. And a video goes viral whereby he says he's been killed. And he's been killed on the orders of Scotland's leader. And the book goes on from there. But it's based, this is a kicker, it is based on a true story. This actually happened not in Scotland, but in South America. It's called, it's called The Dark of the Night. But I think the big theme, the big lesson that I've learned throughout my life is that life is fragile, the world is fragile, and we should always expect the unexpected. All of that said, we should have a laugh while we're here on this planet, because it's pretty wonderful.
Maybe with an occasional Scottish whiskey or so.
It's so our bag.
So your book is a novel, but based on a true story.
Yes.
Interesting. The darker the night when truth is a lie. Folks, check it out. Where is it available? Where can it be purchased? Website information?
Amazon. It's on Amazon and it's coming out on Audible. I think if you don't like reading, if you like listening, I think it'll be out on Audible in the next couple of months. If there's Outlander fans out there, one of the actors from the Netflix series Outlander is reading it, who also happens to be one of the best mates who I went to drama school with. He was a better actor than I was.
I've had a person narrate my third book, but I've narrated my fourth book, and we'll see how that goes.
Which one's better? Somebody doing it?
I obviously paid this guy, but he did a good job, and in fact, the book was nominated for an award for audiobooks. But no, it was fun doing. We're not going to talk about my book now. It's about you, but I didn't write it out first. I just had bullet points, but it wasn't a novel. These are things actually. I always feel like I'm cheating when I'm writing, and of course Ray knows this too, because you're actually doing stuff or writing stuff that you lived. Well, in this case, I'm talking about stuff that I lived, but I'm also transcribing it, and it'll also be out in regular page-turning form in that regards. But yeah, they're both fun, and I'm glad I did both. Now it's hung up in the FBI. It's taken them a year to approve my fourth and final book in my memoir series. You don't have that problem. Ray and I had to go through that pre-publication deal that we all have when it comes to writing books. But if I can ask, the state of the media today, you are still in it, directly, indirectly. It's taken some hits. Even the last week or so, it's taken some hits. Yeah. Maybe what they should have reported, which was obvious to a lot of people, talking about President Biden. Yeah. We don't do a whole lot of politics here, but just media in general, like law enforcement in general, has taken some hits. And Ray and I are defensive of law enforcement. I think unfairly they've taken some hits. What say you about the world of the media and journalism and how it's been addressed in the last several decades?
I think media, I think it's struggling. I think the economic model isn't working. I think particularly in America, you have a huge amount of polarization. I don't think there's a public square, if you like, where people come and debate issues. I think sadly people go to outlets that reflect their political leanings. I think that's a mistake. I'm a big believer in reaching across the aisle. I think you have to understand. I think it's a good thing to have friends and speak to people that you don't agree with, because you always learn. And I think what you come to realize is that we're all products of our past. We're all products of our experience. We're all different, and that's something that should be celebrated. I think media, what worries me most is local media, is the decimation of local media. I think newspapers in communities used to play a key role. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think ultimately media should be about holding the police and public officials and politicians to account. I think there needs to be more journalists. Is there a lack of trust from the public when it comes to the media? Yeah, I think there is. We have to redouble our efforts. You have to be straight. You have to try and report things as best you can, as straight as you can, how you see it, and let people make up their own minds. America's in a tough spot. There's a lot of division. There's a lot of polarization. I think there's a lack of trust. I think when you have a lack of trust in media and in institutions, I think that's a very dangerous place to be. In fact, I've lived in countries where there's very little trust, and there's only two ways you hold the country together. Well, it either falls apart or you have to use repression. So I do worry about the future of America, because I think a lot is at stake. And yeah.
Well, right now, as we're talking, we're in the summer of 2024, and I think the next 5 to 7 months are going to be pivotal in this country. The UK just went through went through an election, a campaign, and things sort of switched there. So did France. A lot of deal making, certainly in France. I understand how that whole aspect worked out, a little bit different in the UK. And yeah, big election coming up here. I think journalists, some of them have brought some of these issues upon themselves. And I think some of them tend to be agenda driven. And I try to avoid reading or watching those and go to the more neutral ones, if that's possible. And there's always been yellow journalism. Fake news wasn't invented, 5 or 10 years ago.
I agree with that. I
think it's an accurate term. One of my favorite news sites has a motto of fake news you can trust, and that's the Babylon Bee. And they really capture some interesting stories on their website that are based in truth, but they put a satirical element to it, of course. Yeah, I'm hoping the future journalists and maybe people who are listening to you sound like a straight shooter. You sound like you've been there. You've been in the trenches. You've definitely walked the walk. Not every journalist does that. I know that for a fact. And you know what's real. You know what's not. You know what's good. You know what's bad. Although there's a big gray area in the middle of those two. Absolutely. But when it comes to reportage, you can report on that gray area, but at some point it has to be facts that are relied on and not opinions, not in a straight news piece. And I have a feeling you agree with that, Martin.
I'm going to throw something in with what you said, Martin, and it's based upon the conversation we've had for the last hour. What I see today in the media is that everybody's in a race to be the first. And I never heard that once from you. What I heard from you that I think is lacking today is that you listened. You listened to both sides, and you reported and let people make the decision. You didn't try to make the decision for them. And that's, I think, the biggest problem, is that the media today doesn't listen. People don't listen. They just want to tell you their thought. And if you disagree, then you're bad. And that's really sad. And that's very concerning to me too. But I think it's very refreshing for something to talk to someone like you who's in the media, who, when Jim and I were in the Bureau, we were never allowed to talk to the media. We had someone specifically that did that. And if we ever talked to the media, they would have sent us to Walla Walla, Washington, or somewhere, Butte, Montana, or
Well,
something.
we had to get approval. We could do it occasionally, but through
Correct.
levels of approval. Yes.
Yeah, it had to, like just think, Jim said he's been trying to publish a fourth book, and it's taken our pre-pub unit a year to be able to go through the book. That's ridiculous. But that's what it is today, because everybody's so afraid of somebody putting something out and saying something that they shouldn't say. And you've been a breath of fresh air. You really have. I mean, just to listen to you, I'm sitting here going, wow, why can't everybody be like Martin? The way he listens to both sides. And you actually said that. You got the story from every side. You just didn't take the most popular side. You listened to everybody. And that's what it is. That's the important part, is listening.
And Ray, he learned a whole other language to talk to the people with whom he was living and writing stories and other communications in that regard. So kudos to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Martin, wrapping up here, any website information, ways to get, you mentioned Amazon, but anything else, appearances, anything like that, where to see you or find you?
You will see me around. If you see me around, come up and say hello.
And I'm not one, but a couple Scotch whiskeys, it looks like.
We'll definitely have to do that. We'll get you down to one of our holiday houses here,
Exactly.
Where are you? I mean, I don't want to get to...
No.
Where are you in Maryland?
I need TC stopper, near Silverstone.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not far.
That's good. That's good.
For any jihadists who may still be looking for the time he spelled his name wrong 15 years ago, we don't want to give any more information than that.
Yeah.
My sister's actually in the police. My brother-in-law's in the police. My aunt was in the police in Glasgow. Policing's different, so I'll tell you.
I love watching British crime shows and the police, at least in the entertainment versions, they different. But I've certainly known UK police officers, Irish, the Garda, and New Scotland Yard, and they're great folks, and as I'm sure your family members are too. Ray, final words, and I'll take us out.
One thing, Martin, who was the guy? He was on back in the 70s. He was hilarious. Always getting involved in stuff. He was English, though. But he did a little bit of police stuff. What the heck was his name?
Was it
Not Benny Hill.
Was it Benny? Yeah, Benny Hill. That's it, Benny Hill. You remember Benny Hill?
I still remember. Do you know, I used to watch Benny Hill when it was in Syria. They used to have Benny Hill reruns on Syrian national TV, because Benny Hill, because it just worked, because there wasn't a lot of talk. So it was one of these shows that just went around the world.
Yeah. It's a good show. We used to have a fan club when I was in college, the Benny Hill fan club. We had that, and we had the Three Stooges. Both things. Go figure.
And Ray stopped reading or watching TV since those days, and
exactly.
But he's still doing pretty damn good. On that pleasant note, again, Ray, always good seeing you. Martin, thank you so much for your time. This was very interesting. I know our audience will find it as such. I'll just say to that same audience, thanks again for listening or watching wherever you do that with us. Check out our social media sites. Check out coldredpodcast.com for all our prior episodes and ones coming up. And subscribe, like us, all that stuff. Thanks to Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our producers, Rick Schilling, our music conductor. And we will see you next time on Cold Red. See you, Ray, and thanks again, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fitz. Thank you, Martin. Must have fell asleep.
This is when they tell us they didn't record.
Yeah, famous last words. Yeah, we're both retired. We can't get in too much trouble, but Why give them any fodder, whoever's out there? But
Matt might have stepped off.
it says 99% uploading.
It's still uploading, so it's still recording.
Where did you base then? You're in Philly? No.
Well, I was born and raised in Philly. Actually, so was Ray.
Right.
Ray lined up most of his career in the Philadelphia division, and I worked in New York City for 7 years. Then I was a profiler in Quantico, Virginia, at the Academy, and that was my 20 years in the bureau.
Wow. I know.
Yeah, we had some fun, and Ray and I worked together well. And now we're doing podcasts, but we actually solved cases back in the day, and